Welcome to the Everyday Discernment Podcast. I am excited today. My guest is Aaron Shust. Aaron is a husband, a father, and a songwriter. He was named Songwriter and New Artist of the Year in 2007 for My Savior, My God. He has traveled the world to lead worship with the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association. Aaron has a deep love for Israel, and his most recent release was a collaboration with Messianic Jewish artist Joshua Aaron and is called The Mountain of the Lord. Aaron, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tim. Great to be on.
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Big fan of your work. And I've seen you recently on Instagram doing some lives. And I thought, wow, it'd be so cool to have you on. And so you were so gracious to accept. And here we are. So
I appreciate that, man. Thank you. Yeah, in this world of COVID the past year, it's been a paradigm shift, hopefully in a good direction. And even since then, when it comes to looking at the way we live and the way we choose to spend our time and what we choose to do, everything gets shifted. Everything changes, and it makes you. There are some things you're forced to have to do differently, and there's some things that make you wonder, why have I always done it this way? And so we've changed up some things, hopefully for the good, over the past year. We'll see where it continues to lead us.
Yeah, I think with how we spend our time was a big thing for last year for a lot of people is, why do we do this? Why do we just constantly go in routines that kind of, don't have any life to them? We just feel burned out by the end of the week. And once a lot of those activities were taken away, it's a good way to analyze, time with family, time with God, and kind of see what's left in the mix and what things we're going to keep going forward when we move into this quote new normal thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. New normal is good. I never want to return to the normal that was.
Yeah.
Even though in the moment I thought it was okay. Yeah. The new normal.
Yeah.
May it be better.
Awesome. So I could have said a lot more about your intro, but anything else you want to fill in about your family, any other history or things you're working on now?
Let's talk about my family. I've been married for 20 years. Is it 21? It'll be 21 this year. These are things I should know off the top of my head. 21 coming up this year. I have 3 boys, and they are fantastic. They're such good kids. We joked about how before we went on air, how school started back up again and there's peace in the house. And yes, of course, when there's quiet in the house, there's definitely quiet. But our boys are so good. So my oldest, Daniel, is 14. And I forget that he's a teenager because, all the stigma that comes with teenagers, hasn't seemed to hit him yet. Sweet boy, his voice hasn't even changed yet. I swear it's on the cusp. Any moment, any day now, there's going to be the sound of 2 men in the house.
Yeah.
Nikki is my little warrior. He's 12 years old and just a fierce boy. And then my youngest is 9, Michael, and he has Down syndrome. And so that's, talk about paradigm shifting. When he was born, and we didn't see that coming. The diagnosis was not given to us in advance. And it was a shock to realize that our lives, as we perceived them to be, was about to be completely different for the foreseeable future.
Yeah.
And we went through all the, I wouldn't say stages of grief, but just like what just happened. And even looking at the little boy that was in the hospital room with us, thinking like, that's not our boy. We had this image for 9 months of what he would look like, and he didn't look like that. But boy, it just took a couple days for us to absolutely, if not earlier, I'll just be honest, to completely fall in love with that little boy and realize he is ours. He's a Shust boy. He needs help. He needs protection. He needs love, and we are absolutely the ones to give it to him. And he's just changed the way. I never could have imagined the dynamic in our family being what it is. And when I think of the word, we had to learn a whole new vocabulary when it comes to referring to children with special needs and people with special needs. And so as opposed to the word normal, the word typical is used. And he's not a typical child. He's atypical in that sense. And I cannot fathom having 3 typical children in our home. It seems like it, and this is not speaking against anybody else who has 3 typical children or more, but it would just seem so boring to me because it's so exciting with a very atypical child. And all of the stresses that happen because of him and his issues, but also all of the joys that would never have happened otherwise. We learn so much about ourselves and our relationship to the Father because of his special needs.
Yeah.
And it's a beautiful thing.
That's awesome. I know a lot of families of foster, including my own sister, and it's a similar thing where, all the struggles and trials, and you're like, why did I sign up for this? And you remind yourself,
Right.
well, I'm bringing love into this person's life that would have never had
Mhm.
it or, experience it. And so it's such a good thing you bring up is that, we can get caught up in our own mental idea of what things should look like, but God gives us a gift sometime of trials. And through that comes a beauty of a refining that we wouldn't find without it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It's a stripping away of selfishness,
Yeah.
for sure. Just, layer by layer. But it's a beautiful thing when you, we're by nature, we're not selfless. So when we find ourselves in situations where we're forced into selflessness,
Yeah.
it's a beautiful thing.
Yeah. So how long have you been a Christian? What was your childhood like and growing up with your family?
I grew up in a Christian home and made a decision at a very young age to follow Jesus, to accept him as my savior. I remember distinctly, I was 4. It was 1 month before my 5th birthday. It was on my mom's spiritual birthday. I'm sorry, on my mom's physical birthday. Biological birthday was my spiritual birthday. There we go.
Gotcha.
And so September 30th, 1980, I guess it was, right before I turned 5. And I remember distinctly laying in my bed at night before bedtime, lying on my stomach, looking at my red and white polka dot pillow and crying because she had explained to me that we all people are sinners.
Mm,
And she basically walked me down a very childlike road of the Romans road, and that the wages, the payment for sin is death, separation from God. And that's what a place we call hell. And but it's, if you confess your sins, if you just say you're sorry, he is faithful. God is faithful. He's just, and he will forgive you. And I was crying because I didn't want to go to hell. And it's, some people might criticize that approach of fear. But you know what? I believe it's truth.
yeah.
And I believe that we need Jesus, and we need to accept the fact that we are not perfect, but he was perfect. And even though she didn't use the word substitutionary atonement when I was 4, almost 5, she explained my need for a savior.
Yeah.
And I also, like, fast forward to being 9 years old. I remember a moment on summer vacation, just kind of walking through the house. Again, I can picture everything and thinking to myself, surely I had no clue what I was talking about when I was 4.
Mm,
God, I mean it. I really want to follow you.
mm,
I want to depend on you. I need you. And I did it again when I was 13, listening at church one Sunday night, listening to a lot of the high schoolers older than me, giving their testimony. It was senior high testimony night,
mm,
and they all kind of fell into the same category of a word that I hadn't heard before called backsliding. And
mm.
they all had made bad decisions, and they all were slipping away from making those good decisions and following Jesus. And there was a degree of guilt that was in their hearts and in their speech that
Yeah.
makes me sad to this day, because there seemed to be no redeeming end to the story. Like, oh, I'm doing bad things, I'm sorry, shoot, and then they walk down and the next person would walk up. But I remember having this fear, like, oh my word, that's what happens to people when they go to high school. That's what's next. And from where I was sitting in the balcony, because I was the volunteer sound person that night, as a 13-year-old, was just like, God, don't let that happen to me. Keep me
Mm,
on the straight and narrow, whatever needs to happen.
yeah.
And so I'm not saying I'm perfect. You can ask my family members, but it's been a lifelong pursuit to follow him.
That's awesome. And it's a good reminder, as Jesus called it, have childlike faith. And a lot of times we think
Mm.
that means blind faith, but it doesn't mean blind faith. It just means faith in something, in someone of Jesus. And that, it's not wrong to have knowledge, but a lot of times when you get older in life, you want all the knowledge before you have faith. But that's not what faith is. Faith bridges the gap between what we know and what God knows, which is
Hmm.
a bigger gap for some than others, depending on how much you know, but it's still a big gap. And so we have to have that faith in God. And so, but children can just kind of accept it. And it's so beautiful when they do that, because it reminds yourself, like, oh man, all the doubts I have, all the things that I question, I just need to trust God. If I truly believe in God, then I will trust, even if I don't have all the answers, which none of us do.
Right. And that's something that I've been singing since I started since I started making music and recording music, and was that song based on that old hymn from the 1850s. I am not skilled to understand, and that's
Mm.
such a great starting point to be able to be like, I don't understand what you're doing,
Yeah.
God. I don't understand. I don't claim to be able to grasp all of your ways. Isaiah 55, his ways are higher, his
Yeah.
thoughts are higher. But to say that I trust you, the word faith, there's a couple Bible translations that translate the word faith, trust. And I love that because it seems to be a step of action. I feel like there's so many Hollywood movies that just throw the word faith around as if it's completely arbitrary and mindless. Just
Yeah.
have faith. I always yell at the screen, faith in what?
Right.
Faith in what? Faith that, I mean, no one, they never finish that. So they just have faith. Like that's
Yeah.
enough to say that sentence. But to have faith that God is in control, that he is sovereign,
Mm.
to have faith that he is good,
Yeah.
that he has a plan, that it's perfect. That's what, do we have faith in that? Well, a lot of people would say, well, no, I don't have faith in that.
Mm.
I just have faith that everything's going to work out all right, I guess. That's
Yeah.
not faith. That's not trust. So
No. So when did you get involved in the music industry? You know, when did you know that you liked to sing? Were you singing as a kid, or when was that kind of catapult point for you?
it was around the same time when I was 4 that my mom, it was a small church, but she was in charge of the music. And so I think whenever there was a gap in the scheduling, she put her kid up on stage. So I
Yeah.
was 4 years old one Sunday night where we practiced the song at home. It was give it all to Jesus. Give them all is what it was called.
Mm.
Shattered dreams, wounded hearts, and broken toys. And he will turn your sorrow into joy. And I sang that. And so the idea of growing up in church surrounded by music were my the two things that helped define me and made me me. You know, singing in the choir, kids choir, adult choir, eventually taking piano lessons. And so I'd play offertories every once in a while. I majored in music education, high school choral music in college, but took a job at a church after I graduated, a Presbyterian church, a PCA church in Atlanta, Georgia. And in between college and that job, I kind of started a band in town in Georgia. So I grew up in Pennsylvania, but I moved to Georgia, North Georgia for college, stayed there for a few years. And so interesting because like all of the experience that I learned with my band and even with like one of the singing teams at the school, traveling around. So between like traveling and setting up and tearing down and performing at church every night, those are the mundane things about that. But there was also something very spiritual and very important about taking the stage night after night after night and ministering to people and singing songs about God and singing songs to God. The Spirit of God would not let me get up on stage if I had not made things right with my band members or my and there was always some kind of conflict somewhere because we're more than one people are gathered, there's going to be conflict, right?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
but man, I countless times I remember walking up to people before we took the stage being like, hey, I'm sorry about today, I'm sorry what I said, I'm sorry for getting angry, forgive me. And even if we didn't come to complete resolution, we walked on stage as broken humans together. And I didn't feel like a hypocrite as I led people in worship. And so that led to leading worship at a church in Atlanta. And I started writing songs for offertories, and I started writing songs with the desire, with the hope that we could sing them together as a congregation. And that eventually led to a recording in somebody's basement. Mike Seamus, who was one of the guitar players, built a studio in his basement, asked me if I would come record some of these songs. One thing led to another. We weren't pushing, we weren't shopping. I wasn't. People were kindly doing it behind my back, shopping this album that we made to some record labels, which is a great way to do it. You know, I didn't have to deal with all the firsthand rejection. I was just busy doing what God had on my plate for then and there. And then the doors that opened, I heard about, and I started making some music in other ways as well.
That was before social media, so it was probably even harder back then to hustle and try to get your name out there. But you had people doing it for you, which was awesome. And so, was that kind of a shock? You know, when how much was that before 2007 when it kind of took off?
Yeah, that was 2004.
Okay.
So it was definitely before social media, but because social media didn't exist, we didn't know it was hard.
Yeah, just what you knew, right?
And while I love social media, or at least I can say I appreciate the benefits of social media. It also has a dark side as well.
Oh yeah.
So just talking to my 14-year-old about that this morning. So balance and discernment and
Yeah.
wisdom, that comes into play there as well. It was definitely a shock to find out when I got the phone call from my friend that, hey, there's a record label that is interested in signing you. They like this album and they would like to, buy the album and release it nationally. I was like, really? Tell me about this. And
Mm.
it was a small record label based in Atlanta where I was living. They were not believers, not a Christian record label. And I checked out their website and it confirmed that they were not believers. And I just wondered if there weren't other if there weren't a Christian label that might, up in Nashville where I live now, that might be interested in this. And that's when they broke the news to me, like, well, we've actually been shopping it to all of the labels in Nashville and nobody's interested. I said,
Oh, wow.
well, these guys sound great. Let's go with them.
Yeah.
And began a 5-year relationship with them. We made 3 albums and they became some dear friends. And I was able to share life with them and share my beliefs. And there were a couple conversations that were interesting. Like, so do you play in, are you going to play like in bars and clubs? Like, no, there's churches that invite people in. There's conferences that need people to lead worship. And so it was an education for them as well. We kind of learned together what we were doing. And after 5 years, we parted ways, and I did sign with the Christian record label in Nashville and stayed with them for 8 years, and made 5 albums with Centricity.
That's so cool.
And then 2 years ago, I went independent. So I've been making one full album and a couple singles since then, independently.
Awesome. That's so cool how God can use you in a spot when you think you have to be surrounded by just Christians, but God can use you whether you're in a job or a place in your life when you aren't, around the saved, but you're called to be the light there. And
Right.
that's what I've seen in my life too, is, well,
And
God, I feel, yeah.
Please continue. Sorry.
No, I was just saying, I've been in the business world for over 20 years, and a lot of that was me saying to God, well, what am I supposed to do here? And God really revealed it to me, like, well, you're why I have you there. You need to pray for these people. You need to intercede on their behalf. You need to be, not just preaching to them, but actually loving them. And, he did call me out of that to full-time ministry, but it wasn't until I actually had that knowledge change that shift in my thinking where, you don't have to be in full-time ministry to do ministry. We all have a ministry, and it's an important realization.
True words haven't been said. I was going to say and that ties in with what you just said, to the first record label, Brash, to their credit, they never demanded that I watered down my theology and my truth. As a matter of fact, the third record that I made with them, called Take Over, the single that went to radio was called To God Alone Be the Glory. Mm. Everything I say and do, let it be all for you. The glory is yours alone. And when I play that in concert, I love to reference like Colossians 3:23 and I think it's 1 Corinthians 10:31 that talk about whatever we do to the glory of God, working unto the Lord. And I tell the story about Bach and Handel and some of those composers that would sign their compositions with SDG, Soli Deo Gloria. So not their own initials, but these same 3 letters, to God alone be the glory. And they weren't even writing songs for the church necessarily. They were writing songs for coronation ceremonies and fireworks displays and big events like that.
Yeah.
But in their mind, no matter what they do, it's for the glory, the positive attention of God.
Yeah. Love that. Haven't heard that before. That's so cool.
Yeah,
let's move in to get to know you a little bit with some icebreakers here. So I love asking my guests what your favorite movie of all time is.
Favorite movie of all time, I think it's Gladiator. I've always loved the Roman era, and especially when you combine that with the stories in the New Testament, there's something so. I mean, with the more you read about the Roman Empire, the more you realize how horrible it was, right? and how epically bad it was. But this story of Gladiator, which is completely fictionalized, except for a couple of people like Commodus and Marcus Aurelius, who were true historical people. Yeah, it's so inspiring to have this moral character, this with a moral center who he's put in this horrible position, and yet he wants to execute the will of Caesar, the wishes of a dying man. no matter what the cost. It costs him his life. Spoiler alert, it's been 21 years. It costs him his life, but he's willing to do what's right.
Yeah.
And I love that. And of course, the music with Hans Zimmer is spectacular. And so that's probably my number one movie.
Yeah, that's a favorite for mine too. Also, same type of theme as Ben-Hur. It's more of a classic, but it's another one where someone who, kind of had a realization that, hey, what we're doing is wrong, and was betrayed and had to work his way back, and very similar story. But
that's a fantastic book, by the way. I read that a couple of years ago.
Really? Oh, cool! I never read that one.
American author, mid 1800s, written as a tool for evangelism. That was his goal.
Oh, wow.
And so, but he spins this story of a fictional character around the life of Jesus. It's pretty amazing.
Awesome. So if you could meet anyone, alive or dead, who would it be and why?
Dead or alive? I think we probably should go with dead. Let's see. Although I'm always on a constant search to remind myself that this world is eternal, and there are some people who have passed on that I know I will meet one day, whether it's the Apostle Paul or Daniel. Mm-hmm. Daniel seems the prophet Daniel seems to be the most upright character in all of the Bible besides Jesus himself.
Yeah.
Everyone else seems to have these faults that were exposed, and I'm sure Daniel was not perfect, but his faults seemed to be hidden. I would like to sit down with Daniel. He experienced so much, taken away from his home into exile, but shown favor. He stuck to what he knew and what he was taught as a child. And was shown favor for that, even though it went against the grain.
Yeah.
And God revealed to him some crazy things and some visions that he records in the latter half of the book that I would love to pick his brain on. So let's go with Daniel. Yeah.
Ask him that one part where he says, you're not allowed to say what it was. The angel told him something and he wasn't able to write it down. What was that? What was that thing? Tell me.
That's great.
What about, I usually do favorite author, but since you're in the music industry, what about a favorite artist that you like listening to yourself?
Let's see. I'll tell you what, the past couple of years, I've developed some friendships. There's something about meeting somebody. So maybe just in a general sense, when you go to somebody's concert and maybe you stand in line at the end and you get a chance to connect with them, all of a sudden your love for their music skyrockets. And so being an artist, we rub shoulders with some other artists every once in a while, whether it's on a tour or a festival or a writing session. I reached out to, and you already mentioned his name earlier, I reached out to Joshua Aaron a few years ago, because my family, after a trip to, my wife and I took a trip to Israel, and I'd gone back a couple times since then. We're just overwhelmed with the idea of keeping the Sabbath, and we can maybe talk about more of this later as we go along. But we decided, let's try this thing. Let's try the whole Friday night to Saturday night Sabbath. We're not Jewish. We're not Seventh-day Adventists. We go to church on Sunday, but sometimes Sunday can be very, very busy and exhausting and full of work, especially when you're in ministry.
Yeah.
So maybe a day of rest when God said to have the day of rest might be an idea. And so, I don't want to necessarily get into the debate of, well, Sunday replaced Saturday and Paul said this and yada, yada. But we decided to try it. And so I'm a creature of, if we're going to do something, we need a good playlist for it, whether it's celebrating Christmas or celebrating March coming up soon here, where we pull out all the Celtic music possible and just enjoy the green of March.
Yeah.
I put together a playlist for the Sabbath, and I was having a hard time finding anything beyond Fiddler on the Roof. And so I started just doing Google searches and Apple Music searches, and I found this guy, Joshua Aaron, who is, he was in his upper 30s at the time, a few years ago. He's a couple of years younger than me, and Messianic Jewish, and writing songs of worship that we just primarily based on words from the Old Testament, but also New Testament as well. He loves Jesus, calls him by his Hebrew name, Yeshua. And we started adding a lot of his music to our playlist. And I reached out to him and developed a friendship. And we've done a lot of work together, concerts and traveling and touring and even recording some. But his music is so pure and it's based on scripture. So Joshua Aaron is his name. And I'll add this, but through friendship with Joshua, I became familiar with a band named Makedim, which is Hebrew from the East.
Okay.
Hebrew for from the East. And They sing completely in Hebrew, and they sing only lyrics from the Bible, mainly the
Hmm.
Psalms, occasionally songs from Isaiah, Song of Solomon,
Yeah.
but they take like directly from Scripture and sing it in Hebrew. And the music is fantastic. It's brilliant. It's fun.
Nice.
It feels Middle Eastern. So Makedem is Miqedem.
Oh,
Love
wow. Okay.
Makedem.
I'll have to
And
check that out.
Joshua Aaron.
It reminds me
Yeah,
of Sons of
they actually
Korah.
write it in Hebrew, but if you were to spell it in English, that's how you would spell it.
Yeah. Reminds me of Sons of Korah. They used to sing just the Psalms, and I used to
Yes,
listen to them. And
cool.
I loved your Mountain of the Lord song. I listened to it recently, and it reminded me a lot of. I listened to Paul Wilbur a lot, and
Yes, yeah,
he's
Uncle
someone
Paul.
too that I met at a concert and have a picture. My son has a picture in his room of me and him, and
Nice, excellent.
love his music.
Yeah, he's great.
Cool. So let's move into the questions I ask all my guests about a time you had godly discernment in your life, a decision that you were maybe facing, and kind of what you learned from it, how you knew it was God leading you in that direction. And then we'll talk about a time that you didn't have godly discernment and kind of what you learned from it.
Great. So we might start with the good decision.
Sure, if you'd like.
Sure, let's do that one. I was thinking about this, and this one maybe the jury is out. I'll start with this. When I was leading worship, because to help explain my worldview on making good decisions and discernment, when I was leading worship at the church, Perimeter Presbyterian Church, Perimeter Church in Atlanta, our pastor Randy Pope said something that I've never forgotten. I've visited this wisdom, I believe, often. He said, "You can never be out of you can never be out of God's will, but you can be out of God's wisdom."
Mm,
And I think that the situation, the context of that is so many. I was in my young 20s when I heard this, and so many of my friends and peers were not married yet. I got married at 24, and I might have been a couple of years married whenever I heard this. But one of the biggest worries was, oh, I'm so afraid of making a decision that's out of God's will.
yeah.
And whether that's about who to date or who to marry or what job to take or where to live or what to do, I think the Presbyterian view of the doctrines of grace and the sovereignty of God is very strong. And his and anything that elevates God and lowers man is something worth considering. And as opposed to the opposite of elevating man and lowering God. And he
Yeah.
said, we're not strong enough to be out of God's will, but we can make unwise decisions.
Yeah.
And that gave me such peace to know, like, hey, I'm going to do my human best to make wise decisions based on what I believe is in accordance with God's will. Reading the Proverbs, reading the stories of the Bible, and finding out what was esteemed by God when men took action and what was considered a bad idea by God when men took action.
Yeah.
That's using wisdom. And then you move forward without fear, knowing that we're not strong enough to be out of God's will, God's permissive will, God's perfect plan.
Right.
So whether it's dating or marrying someone, you might not know whether it's the right person, but are you the right person?
Right.
Are you going to love that person well? Are you going to be selfless? So that's the perspective of that. I think to use an example of what I believe was a good decision most recently is just a few years ago when we were living in Pennsylvania. We'd moved from Atlanta, and I could fast forward through all the places that we thought we might live. And we moved back to Pennsylvania. I remember a friend, whenever I told him we're going to be moving to Pittsburgh from Atlanta, he said, "Well, that is a sentence I've never heard before. I've never heard anybody say out loud, we're moving to Pittsburgh." And I think there's sometimes, not always, but sometimes the decisions that we make that seem to go against conventional wisdom.
Yeah.
When you feel a prompting to do something like that fits into that category, I'm just like, well, wouldn't that just be like God to call us to a place that no one's ever said out loud, I think we should move to Pittsburgh? And it was absolutely the right call. Now, in our hearts, my wife and I, and my kids as well, we were ready to live there for the rest of our days. We felt very much at peace, and I'll categorize that as contentment. And yet there did come a moment where we felt we needed to move to Nashville, Tennessee, where I had been working since 2005 and said I would never live here. So there's another example of whenever we feel led in a certain direction to do something that seems counterintuitive to our personal desires.
Yeah.
Well, maybe there's something to this. Maybe God's calling us to this. God gave my wife a dream that we would live here.
Mm.
And it felt right. And she sat on that for a month by herself and prayed about it before she told me about it. She said, sit down, let me finish this before you say anything.
Yeah.
And Tim, there was such a peace in my heart about something that I had never thought about doing,
Mm-hmm.
let alone, well, actually, I'd said that I would never do it. The idea of actually considering it seriously never crossed my mind. And yet there was an immediate peace. And I take that as an indication, as the needle is now tipping in this direction. God, I said I would never do this, but you just gave me a peace about it.
Yeah.
I don't want to leave the school systems and the church and the friends and the things that we've established here. Like my youngest boy had 18 specialists in the hospital system. So relocating all of those and getting new ones in a new city, that's a lot of work.
Yeah.
But God was calling us to something that didn't make sense, and we felt a peace about it. So we had to answer the questions over and over again. Why are you moving to Nashville? With the answer, we don't know. Oh, is it because you're in music? Honestly, I wish that'd be a really easy answer if I could just say yes and we could move on, but that's not why. I have no clue why. It might not be about music at all.
Right.
And little confirmations just in the past 4.5 years that, wow, this is so much a part of our life now. Whatever it might be, my love for Israel and my love for the Jewish people and my support of them, my prayer for them and the relationships that I have with them and some of the songs that I've written never would have happened had we stayed in Pittsburgh because of relationships that we made. And now I'm not saying that's the reason, but I am acknowledging that those things wouldn't have happened otherwise. So I'd like to believe that was a moment for discernment.
Yeah.
That was a moment to listen to the whispers of the Holy Spirit that said, peace.
That's so good. And there's so many good things we can learn from that example about just taking time to listen, being in collaboration with your spouse and then moving where peace leads you, because, God will give us, discernment that is usually preceded by peace. And even if it doesn't make sense to the world, when they asked you, why are you doing this? You're like, well, I don't know, because God tells me to. So many decisions that are of God will be what is foolish to the world's wisdom. And so that's a good example. And I love what you said too about, a lot of times we might feel that we're out of God's permissive will, if you will. But, you look at the story of Jonah, and God still had his way for the people of Nineveh. Now, granted, Jonah took the long route to get there, and we can bring upon ourselves, because of free will, a lot of hardship that is unneeded and unwarranted. But God, at the end of the day, will still have his way in our life. And even if it's through kicking and screaming and, and I love Jonah. He was just, God must have been so happy to have him around when he was cursing himself and everything after the fact. But you see parallels with what we do a lot of times. And what Jonah did is we run from God and we say, no, I'm not doing that. And we find ourselves 5 years later doing the very thing that we said we wouldn't do.
Well, look at chapter 4 with Jonah. Jonah had incorrectly discerned that God was going to execute judgment. Yeah. And he pulled up a front row seat, took out a snack, took out some popcorn, and was ready for it.
Yeah.
And that wasn't God's will. He had discerned incorrectly. And I think that's something, talk about a lesson to be learned and caution. When I think of the word discernment, a couple things can come to mind. What we think it means, what it might mean, what people have used it to mean. I feel like it's often used as, it would never be said as a weapon, but like, boy, I'm just, I always have to stifle the laugh when people tell me that they're discerning. I'm like, I feel like that's like saying I'm well, God's blessed me with wisdom, or God's blessed me with beauty, or I have a fantastic voice. It's like, what? It's a positive thing. Maybe you shouldn't speak about how discerning you are, because that usually precedes, here's what I see in you.
Yeah.
And here's what you need to fix. Yeah. And you have to listen to me because I'm discerning. Like I want to point that finger back to myself. And if I'm discerning, let it be about the repair that needs to happen in my own life and my own soul.
Oof, that's good.
And if I keep on repairing myself, then everybody else is going to be happier to be around me, I would like to think.
Yeah.
And you know what? If you really feel like the people that you're around need to change, a combination of demonstrating good behavior and praying that the Spirit would convict them,
Yeah.
that the Spirit would speak words to them, and that they could discern what needs to be done. Yeah,
That's so
Billy
good.
Graham, going back to him, always said it's God's job to judge, the Father. I
My job
interpret
to
that's what
love,
he
right?
meant. Yeah, the Spirit's job to convict, and my job to love.
My
Our
job.
job to
Yeah, I
love.
love that. That's so good.
Um, so yeah, I think that might segue into my bad decision. Are you ready for that?
Yeah,
Let's
let's do it.
end on the bad decision.
Yeah.
I labored through this. I think one of the things that I'm learning, and this did bring up the story that I will tell, is that I'm discerning when to speak and when not to speak.
Mm.
I am historically an oversharer.
Hmm.
And as I'm thinking about what story I could tell about a foolish decision, and I could regale you for hours with foolish decisions that I've made. Oh, this one time I did this. This one time I ran a red light. Like I don't think that's what we're talking about when we're talking
Yeah.
about discernment. So I need to discern what dirty laundry I air right now, what's important to say and what's not important. And then it's easy for me to come up with all of the stories of lack of discernment, but I need to be careful what I share
Sure.
right now.
Yeah.
Some things are they're covered, they're forgiven, they're under the blood, but there are things to learn. I think of when I was a young worship leader, probably 25, 26. I had just started writing some of these songs that we discussed earlier. And one of the other worship leaders at our church, he was I think at the time he was my boss. He was much older than me. He was 45 years old. I'm 45 years old right now. So, but when I'm telling the story, I was 25 years old. So he was 20 years older than me,
Yeah.
and obviously he knew nothing, right? Because
Right.
he's the previous generation. God forgive me. But he was so sweet about wanting to play one of my songs. And so it was the weekend that he was on as a worship leader. I was not. And he learned the song, taught it to the band that was a unique band for him for that week. And I came in at rehearsal and I listened to it. And Tim, I'll admit that I was horrified by what I heard.
Mm.
It was the wrong key. It was the wrong speed. It was the wrong production. There were instruments being used that I never would have used in a million years.
Mm.
Harmonies that were sung that I never would have endorsed. And I walked home a little crestfallen. And in the weekend came and went, and we had 3 services. And the Monday morning debrief meeting happened in the conference room. And the open question was given, what do we think? Anybody have any thoughts, any constructive criticism, any things we should change? We're always about, improving and tweaking. And I sat there for, I don't know how long, not too long, with this feeling, and we're getting into it, with this feeling of, I have to say something for the betterment of our team. I have to say something. And I said something, and I said the words, I was embarrassed. It was true. And in that moment, you might have said, I'm discerning that I have to speak the truth.
Yeah.
My kids watched the Charlie Brown movie a lot, the new cartoon that came out. And I think Peppermint Patty's standing on Marcy's head, and she says, "You're hurting me, sir." And she had just said something cruel. And she's like, "I'm sorry, but it's true." Like, "No, you're really hurting me," because she's standing on her head.
Yeah.
And I think we often take that position, and I took that position, and I'm sorry, but it's true. It embarrassed me. And that's not, and I could tell he was embarrassed in the moment, and he was kind in the moment and did not lash out, but he did pull me aside later on and said, "Aaron, you hurt my feelings when you said what you said, when you said it." And what could have been done, man, he just came alongside me like such a beautiful, patient mentor.
Mm-hmm.
He said, "You could have taken me aside instead of a conference room full of 15 people, and told me that it embarrassed you, and we could have discussed this." Man, I think of that often with regret in my heart. And this individual went on to do many great things and say many words of wisdom that I've kept. But because this story didn't present him in a flattering light, I won't mention his name. But it's more about me and I was not discerning to keep hold my tongue.
Yeah.
In that moment, I thought this needs to be said. This needs to be, it didn't, maybe not in that theater,
Yeah.
maybe not at all. Maybe
Yeah.
that was just my pride that was hurt, and
Yeah.
I needed to swallow that pride. And I ran somebody over, man,
Yeah.
and I did it with gentleness. I did it with respect,
Yeah.
but I should have kept my mouth shut.
That's such a good example. Thank you for sharing. And it's one of those things where, we're called to bring the gospel or just our words with truth and love. And we could be true for days, but if we don't mix it with love, and it was such a good teachable moment. I had a similar thing I'm not going to go into in my career where I did a very similar thing. And that's why I put a chapter in my book, Discernment with Our Words, because, it's all about what James talks about, and I tell my son, once your words come out of your mouth, you can't put them back in your mouth. You can try to repair the damage, but a lot of times it's too late. And you can do the best you can and learn from it and move on. But having
And
discernment with our
you
yeah,
could be humble and say, I'm
yeah,
sorry and please forgive me. You can cry, but that person carries that with them for the rest of their lives.
exactly.
Yeah, we
So
all
good.
do.
Awesome. Well, I want to move on here. We don't have too much time left, but I want to give you a chance to talk about the Sabbath and why that's been important to you and kind of what lessons we can take into our lives as Christians and really how it was, it's not for, and I'll start, we've started to do that as well. And it's not,
Mm.
we don't do it for our salvation. We don't do it because it's a rule we have to follow. God gave us a Sabbath for man, and Jesus said, Sabbath is for man because there is a benefit in resting, and God knows what what man needs and why it's important to us. And so there is a benefit that is for physically, spiritually, emotionally when you do take a Sabbath. And so if you want to just expand upon that.
Yeah, I think if you would have asked me 5 years ago, I would have said, you know what, I do Sabbath on Sunday. So, I rest, I watch some football, take a little nap.
Yeah.
And there's something that's so much more powerful about doing it with, well, the keepers of the book and the keepers of the Sabbath, the Jewish people, and especially as I've developed a relationship with them, knowing that they are moving into the Sabbath. And I've read some incredible books on the Sabbath, and I've definitely read some things from people who I respect theologically, who say, no, that's abolished. We don't have to do that anymore. The disciples started meeting on Sunday, and there's a couple of verses in the New Testament that may indicate that, but there's also some really, really scholarly work done saying no. When it says after the Sabbath, we're still talking about Saturday night, because we can go to Genesis. The first there was night, then there was day. I don't want to get into the nitpicking. Here's my thought. Even if it were proven to me at this point that I didn't have to, that it's not, and I agree with you, it's not a salvific regulation.
Yeah.
It has been the number one blessing in our family, to our family, for our family in the last few years. There are still moments where I have to hop on a plane on the weekend, because that's when concerts and conferences seem to happen.
Right.
And I will say that when that's the case, I grieve leaving. I grieve the lack of rest. It's not about taking a nap on Sunday. It's not about taking a nap on Saturday.
Right.
It's about moving into sacred time. And acknowledging that time, knowing that people all around the world are remembering their creator and remembering that he is the provider, and to cease from our regular work and to cease from our regular conversations. And we pick up on a lot of things that have been that are Jewish traditions, whether it's the lighting of the candles or the making of the challah bread. It's a celebration. There's but the idea that there's no fasting. If you're in the middle of a fast, you stop and you celebrate the Sabbath. Not talking about the future, not planning. We catch ourselves all the time. Saturday afternoon. So next week I'm gonna no planning on the Sabbath, and it's just free to be like, you know what? I'm just gonna live in this moment. Let's go outside because the sun's out. Let's stay inside and rest because it's raining. But let's just rest, and it is food for our souls. I'll close with this. We recently learned that why the Sabbath is considered 25 hours, not 24,
Mm.
because it starts at sunset and it ends when you see the third star in the sky on Saturday night.
Mm.
I was like, okay, that's cool, but why? I don't know. And it was Abraham Heschel who wrote this book called Sabbath in the 1950s, I believe. And he said, just like when you invite a guest over for dinner, you delay their exit because you want to linger just a little bit longer.
Wow.
You don't want them to leave. In the same way, we feel that with the Sabbath, and we just linger a little bit longer.
Yeah.
And we have the little the separation service, ceremony at the end, just a couple minutes where we light a candle and pray some prayers in the in this Jewish prayer book that was given to me by a friend. And it's just basically some prayers from the Psalms that are very one's blessed. This is not from the Psalms, but blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who separates between what is holy and what is common, between light and darkness, between holy and common. And that's how it, I'm sorry, forgive me. Yes, holy, exactly. Holy and common. And that day feels so holy, set apart. So just my personal testimony. It's been so good.
What's a book you would recommend if someone's listening to this and wants to know more about the Sabbath?
I think I'm reading another one right now. I've just started, so I'll give a half endorsement. It's called Sabbath to Sabbath. I'm forgetting the name of the author. It's downstairs right now. Otherwise, I would grab it. But the one I did mention, Abraham Heschel, he's a Jewish rabbi. I believe this is the first book he wrote after he learned the English language, and it puts us all to shame. It's beautifully written.
It's one of those things that anyone listening, our first response can be, well, I don't have time for that, or I don't have to do that. And like you're saying, you don't have to, but why not consider it if there is a benefit to it? And if God instructed us to, in not a rule following way, but seeing the benefit of it and hearing your story, I would just encourage people to have an open mind and to not start it tomorrow, but start to read about it, learn about it, pray about it, ask God, I would like to do this, and let God open those doors in your life. You think your Saturday's completely packed. I used to be in a job where I worked Saturdays and now I don't, and God can transition you into a new phase of your life where you have an appreciation for the Sabbath. And then he can show you the benefit to your spirit and to the connection that you can get with God if you start observing it. So I would leave people with that. And then just give you a real quick chance to talk about your love for Israel, kind of how Christians can have God's heart for Israel today, and pray for the salvation of the Jews who do not yet know Jesus. In your song, Zion, you declare the promises of God for his people. So just talk real quick about, God's promises for Israel, Christians who, come into a lot of different theologies about Israel we're not going to go into, but just, what would you say along the subject of Israel?
I think my heart began to blossom for Israel when I first visited in 2016, January. I was getting ready for the K-Love Bible tour. And so myself and Blanca went with a few other people. And I met a friend, who's a dear friend, David Kern. He was one of the cameramen. He's sitting in the back of the little tour bus. And while the tour guide would finish and the tour guide was not a believer in Jesus, but a great tour guide, Jewish man named Amir, and he would give us all fantastic, this, if you look over here, you'll see this, look over here, you see that, this is where this happened. And every time he would finish his little blurb on the little CB, my new friend David would lean forward and whisper to my wife and myself, no, what he didn't tell you is that it actually says, for example, in the book of Jeremiah, that in the last days, the hills of Judea and Samaria will once again burst forth with life and flow with wine. And that's why there's these vineyards all over Judea and Samaria that just took root a few years ago. And this is prophecy fulfilled. That's just one example, example after example. And so he actually gave me a list of verses that talk about the return of the Jewish people in the last days to their land, and then eventually to the heart of God, as we read about with the story of the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones in Ezekiel 37. And I just went home and I thought, I need to read my Bible again. I've read it before, cover to cover, a couple of times. I had to do it in Bible college. I've done it once since then, volitionally. Let's do it again. And I was underlining all new verses, and I was just blown away by the truth that I had somehow missed in previous readings. And it led to the song Zion, just the recounting of the promises of God, kind of in chronological order, starting with Genesis 12 to Abraham. I will make you a blessing. You'll be a great nation. I will give you this land. I'll bring you back home. I will scatter you, but I will gather you again in the last days. And so that's what that song is about. And I think just the relationship with, there's something about, Jeremiah talks about stand at the crossroads and ask about the ancient ways. And that's what I'm doing. I'm going to the people who've been the keeper of the book for years and years and centuries and thousands of years. And I say, teach me what you know. Yeah. Teach me your ways. I've been going to church all my life, but I'm curious to hear your perspective on this. And I'm learning a lot, and it's kind of like, what The Chosen seems to be doing for a lot of people. You watch Jesus in a very Jewish, to be honest, a very human, but also a very Jewish context. Yeah. And you realize, Jesus wasn't Italian. Jesus was Jewish. The disciples were Jewish, and the world they lived in was Jewish, and they went to synagogue on Saturdays. And this is amazing. This is paradigm shifting potentially. So it's a beautiful discovery. And what I'm about to release next week is Isaiah 53, a single, just in time for Passover and Good Friday, that talks about the sacrifice of our Lord that was prophesied in the book of Isaiah 700 years before the crucifixion. Wow. It feels ancient and true and right in this journey that I'm on.
Yeah. Awesome. So yeah, that'll be out when people listen to this. So just give you a chance to plug anything else, any ways people can connect with you, and anything else you might be working on.
Oh, just aaronshust.com is where that's the hub for everything that I'm working on right now. So I'll post pictures of my little boy, and my wife's about to hop back on social media again. She's been off for a while and busy, and we're going to figure into her insights. My wife, she's very insightful, very discerning. I can brag on her. She's very discerning, very insightful. And what she shares is always deep and meaningful. So my wife, Sarah, is going to be sharing some stuff as well soon. And I'll point people that direction.
Awesome. Well, this was a treat for me, Aaron. Thank you so much for coming on. God bless you and your ministry.
God bless you, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Everyday Discernment Podcast. For more information on Discerning Dad, go to discerning-dad.com. Be sure to follow on all the social media platforms. Just search for Discerning Dad. Please share this podcast with a friend and leave an honest review on whichever platform you listen. Feel free to send any comments, suggestions, questions, or prayer requests at discerningdad@outlook.com. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight.